welcome back. This is the afternoon of the second day of Inside Security in EMEA. If you've joined us for other sessions, welcome back. If this is the first session that you've joined, welcome. There are plenty of sessions available on demand if you haven't been able to get to the rest. This afternoon, this is our last formal webcast before we go into the happy hour session at 4 o'clock BST. And I would like to hand over to the very wonderful Dan Bridges and Rob Allen. Off you go, chaps.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm Dan Bridges. I'm the EMEA Technical Alliances Director, and I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Mr. Rob Allen, who's our Solutions Architect for EMEA. Now, we're going to cover a topic which we've titled When the Insides Go Outside. Don't be alarmed. This isn't some kind of horror movie type thing. But before we get going, we've got a couple of points of order to cover. Remember to register your attendance to this webinar for your CPE credits, or report your attendance into the ISC2 portal. You'll get your points for it, and it's an important thing for you to do to keep those accreditations up. What we're also doing here is we're measuring and monitoring who attends these sessions. There are points, and points always make prizes. We are monitoring who attends, so we have got all the registration details down. And we do monitor who attends at the end as well. So if you want your points, stay to the end and listen to everything. And obviously those points do turn into prizes. You can see them there on the right-hand side. I can't guarantee that's the exact color of the Nintendo Switch, which is available, but I know which one my eye is on. And we'll be adding those up at the end of all the webinars and doing a prize draw for each of those. Now, one of the most important things that we're doing for the whole part of this is our charity contributions at the end of this later this afternoon. So at 4 o'clock UK time, 5 o'clock Central Europe, 7 p.m. Middle East time, we have a collection of speakers and a panel where you can come back through and ask questions. We'll give some answers. We've got several of the presenters, the webinar hosts, answering those panels. And we've also got a little bit of light-hearted entertainment coming through from the beer farmers as well. They're always a good group to do some funny stuff with. Now, obviously, anyone that attends, we're going to give you the option of where you want to have your charitable donation sent to, which we will send into. So important part to attend that to make sure those charities get that. Back to the topic, insides, outside. What are we talking about when we talk insides going outside? And what are the threats that are associated with those? So we've broken that down into compromised insiders and malicious insiders. Now, from a kind of sort of security point of view, they actually look very similar. Valid credential, doing bad stuff. If we look at it from a compromised insider point of view, what does that look like? Well, that looks like a set of stolen credentials. Someone's identity has been taken by some malware, or their identity has been phished, maybe some social engineering, but a valid credential that's in the hands of someone you don't want it to be. Now, that really is a very, very prevalent attack. We see it as really the number one action in breaches. Any breaches that you read in the papers, you see in the press, you read detailed internet articles about, whatever, and you look at the details of those and you look into those, most, if not all, involve some form of compromised credential somewhere. It's how people get in. It's a very, very serious use case that needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed well. If we look at malicious insiders, we're still looking at a valid credential moving around the network, but we're looking at it from a different type of view. We're looking at an employee who is leaving, he's at high risk, wants to take something. I mean, we're quoting a stat there of 41% of organizations in the last year. I'd probably personally mused that might be even higher. Anyone that's left a company, maybe it's not key information that's been taken, but most employees do try and leave with something. They take some information with them. Now, that can either be detected by some DLP technologies, but they're very noisy, they're hard to work. That is, again, a serious threat, is the malicious insider. Now, when it comes to incident response, we're seeing a date here, and that's a year's worth of time. We see stats from how long an incident is running for before it's detected. 240 something days is a common stat that's been battered around for quite some time. So what we're seeing really is, a year's worth of time before something starts to when we can actually wrap it up and say we've dealt with it. Now that's involving the detection of that takes a long time. The investigation takes a long time. Gathering the forensics of what's happened in there takes a long time. We need to do a better job of that. The compromised insiders being the number one threat, the malicious insiders happening everywhere, and the length of time it takes to detect, investigate, and wrap that up are serious, serious issues for organizations at the current time. Let's take that in the context of where we're sitting today, trying to move into a new normal. What happens when we sprinkle more remote working on top of that? What does that look like for a compromised insider when we take the same people who are working in the office and we put them in a different location from different machines at different times? How do we make sense of all of that? This new normal of remote working is going to make this much, much harder to detect and deal and respond to these incidents of these different types of insider threats. Let's change tack a little bit. What MITRE has done for us here, I'm sure you're all familiar with the attack framework. What we've laid out here is just a little bit of enforcement there and sort of ratification from MITRE, showing what the most common used techniques and tactics across initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, and obviously credential dumping really is kind of gaining credential and exploiting accounts anyway. What those are and how common they are. MITRE floats them to the top. They're the most prevalent and the most used types of tactics, and they're all involving valid accounts. It's what people are after, is those types of valid accounts. Obviously, the execution stuff, obviously that's an entity-based discussion, which is why we don't see any account-based stuff into there. But this really reinforces, not only do we have a big problem with detecting those types of things, and they are everywhere with compromised credentials and malicious insiders, but we also see the tactics and techniques are very, very prevalent. So the goals of an organization really are to try and identify these risky users, these risky insiders, to help detect these hard to detect attacks. They're distributed. They're distributed amongst internal equipment on site. They're distributed amongst cloud technologies and cloud logs. We need to try and find these unknown threats as well. We don't know what they're going to look like. If we do have some detection capability in there, they tend to be very noisy. We mentioned DLP just now. It's a very, very noisy technology. How do we reduce those false positives? How do we get this time to answer whether or not this is a good alert, whether it's a bad alert? How do we triage and investigate those things really, really quickly? Those are the goals of the organization that customers, partners, providers are trying to get done. We see the challenges on the right-hand side. What are the difficulties of doing that? It is in cloud. We lack context to understand what some of those individual events are, let alone the too many alerts. And it's too complicated to do. We're talking about inside credentials happening here. That's going to touch hundreds and hundreds of different entities within a year. 240 days, something's there. That's a lot of stuff to go and investigate and touch. That creates many, many large, complicated search queries. Very, very complex amount of data that needs to be analyzed. Now, let's sprinkle into that some questions that we should be asking ourselves when we come and look at an incident. Who is involved in this incident? What are the credentials involved into this? Who's behind this? What assets are involved in this particular incident? Can we track what's happening here? What's been touched? What's been used throughout this particular incident? We have compliance asking us now, compliance and regulation asking us what happened before, during, and after this incident. We're even time bound to produce that information. How do we get that stuff quickly? Any CISO should be asking the question, has this ever happened before on my network? Am I looking at the first time? Did I just get lucky? Can I go and search for, I've done something clever here, I've found something. Can I go and pivot out and find out if that's ever happened before? Can I find out if it's actually happening elsewhere in my network at the same time? These are all really, really tough questions that we need to be asking ourselves, and the organizations need to be asking, and providers need to be providing answers to these questions for these customer challenges. So I'm just going to hand over to Rob now, who's going to walk us through, kind of how we answer these questions with Exabeam.
Thank you very much, Dan. Okay, so hopefully those kind of questions that Dan's just posed has left you thinking that, yeah, we can do a lot of that, but it's fairly painful, it's time consuming, and it's reasonably error prone. Then, Exabeam, clearly we can help. That's why we're here. So as a platform, we can operate as a full scene. So we have logging, analytics, and SOAR capabilities, but we can also work with your existing platform too. So if you've already got an investment in time of a logging tool and it's doing a good job for you, then we're not suggesting you should get rid of that. In fact, we will complement it. So I think enable you to make more of that initial investment. We have a whole range of out-of-the-box content. So again, sort of things that would talk to the things that Dan's raised, those kind of questions. That's all pretty much out of the box for us in terms of models, rules, contents within the platform. How do we do a lot of this work? Well, the main thing we're going to talk around really and show on our later demo is our timeline. So as we can see on the right-hand side here, we have a timeline for Howard. And effectively what we do is for all users and all assets, we build in near real time timelines of our activities. So we show the things that they logged into, we show applications, servers, and we can show any processes that they've run. So really any kind of activity that user's done, we can demonstrate it inside this timeline. So by building these timelines out for users, we're able to answer the who and what was involved. We can also give a centralized place for logging as well. As many organizations and enterprises now have shifted to be not just on-prem, but cloud sources as well. Things like Office 365, Azure, Google, so that kind of thing, AWS, all these different types of log sources, and bringing into kind of a centralized location to analyze and see activity is something of a serious challenge for most organizations. Even if you're collecting on-prem log, you may not be actually bringing in log sources from those cloud locations. And then we start to build into our tooling as well, things like models and machine learning. And again, we're going to go through exactly how that works, but that enables us to understand what normal looks like. And by being able to visualize normal behavior, it gives the analyst a baseline for their investigation. So they can understand when a user starts acting in ways that are different to how they would normally operate. And of course, having those timelines in, we give you context to alerts. So automatically showing you what happened before and after. So again, from those questions from Dan, has that kind of activity occurred before in your environment? Is it still happening somewhere else? Because we can give you context around alerts, we're able to show you exactly what's going on inside your state. And again, we'll show that inside one of our demos later. So one of the main things that I'm often involved in conversations with prospects is around SOAR. So SOAR, automation, kind of trying to do more with less, and kind of, again, trying to step up in terms of resolving issues that we see inside of an organization. And conversations typically go from the detection stage. So the conversations simply go from the detection stage and then immediately jump into response. So detection could be, we have correlation rules to look for known bad activities, perhaps. And then if we see something we don't like, then we immediately go to response. And response could be validating a file hash. We could be looking at isolating an endpoint, quarantining an email, all those kind of fairly standard activities that we see. However, from a report that we had commissioned last year, we can see that a whole raft of time and energy for analysts, for SOC teams, are actually spent in this middle section here. And most organizations are not really looking at automating these kind of workflows. And because they're lacking that level of automation, we see a lot of kind of tier one analysts and perhaps even tier two to a degree, spending an awful lot of time gathering information, validating it, searching for data points, and trying to understand if something's good, bad, or otherwise. And because of that, we find a situation whereby organizations are kind of looking around circa 45% of alerts are only being kind of investigated. So then we get to a scenario that an organization is making decisions on whether to investigate an alert based on time rather than based on a security conversation. And then we sort of tie that into kind of how many false positives, particularly if that ties into platforms like DLP. Whilst a very vital part of an organization, due to the sheer volume of noise they generate, it also generates a level of fatigue as well. So not having an ability to prioritize different types of alerts all starts to create this fairly complicated environment for analysts. And really, that's kind of one of the strong areas that Exabeam comes into, is building those timelines that I spoke earlier. Now, the ability to generate those timelines gives a consistency for an organization. If I were to ask 3-4 different analysts in an organization to investigate an incident for me and to generate a timeline, typically I'm going to end up with 3 or 4 different answers. And that's driven by tribal knowledge, so within the SOC team themselves, the experience of the analyst that's answering that question, and the availability and understanding of the log sources. So if we have things like Windows in play, and anyone that's delved deeply into Windows event codes knows that there's a whole raft of pain and data points within them. But then if we mix something like CyberArk in there for privileged access management, and then start looping in Azure, Office 365, that's a heck of a lot of complexity. And for an analyst to then build out a timeline in a reasonable time frame for a user, for multiple users, it's starting to become an impossible affair. So how do you then choose what to investigate and what to work on if you're spending all of that amount of time doing that initial kind of triage and investigation? So this is kind of where Exabeam is going to step in. Dan?
I think this is a really, really powerful slide, actually. There's some really powerful stats and a really powerful set of observations from it. You know, we see a lot of money being spent on automating response. Huge, great big market out there. A lot of companies are spending a lot of effort into that, but they're not spending money at the moment on triaging and investigation. You know, more time is spent in triage and investigation. Let's spend the automation dollars in there. Let's get that running fast. I think that's a really good way of observing that, and some good market trends that are available for improvement.
Yep, absolutely. So building those timelines, adding context, we start to automate that SOC workflow. So our automation piece begins at the very first moment an analyst looks at what a user or an asset's been up to. We're not talking at the very end of killing a process or running a file hash. We're starting our automation story at the very, very beginning. And because we're doing that, we add that level of consistency and visibility of that response. So enabling analysts to easily see changes in behavior and giving them that context about why it's unusual or why it's normal. The current worldwide situation that we find ourselves in, it's a fairly prime example of this shift of behavior, what's become perhaps the new normal for all of us. But it also shows that not all change is malicious. So if we take Exabeam as an example, in EMEA, we predominantly work from home. We have offices, but a lot of our staff, we work from home. However, in HQ, a lot of them all work out of our main offices in San Mateo. And they all have laptops, but they would typically go to the office, they would badge in, and they'd access applications and services all within inside the main building. But now we start to see that all those employees are actually working remote. They're still working on their laptops, but they're starting a VPN session in the morning and then doing their normal daily activities. And that could look suspicious because we're seeing VPN activity that wouldn't typically have been there, i.e. 9 a.m. in the morning, if that's when they're starting. But what we're trying to say is that a single anomaly is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. So just seeing one particular anomaly is interesting, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. However, if we start to see those same user credentials logging in from a VPN at 9 a.m. in the morning, but that VPN is coming from maybe a different ISP, a different region, or a different country, that starts to make it much more interesting. And then if the user accesses servers and applications that are outside of their normal daily life, then that makes it much more alarming. However, how would an analyst draw those conclusions about what's normal and what's different if they don't have the ability to see a baseline to understand what is normal for a user?
Thank you, Rob. You'll all be glad to know that's the end of our slides there. What we'll do now is we'll actually take a look. I'll ask Rob to navigate us through a short little demo of how we can show some of that information, how we can show that Exabeam gives the analyst these types of tools as well. And then I'll run through a little explanation of a timeline, maybe show an investigation as an analyst would look at it. And then we'll save some time for some Q&A at the end as well. So if you've got any questions so far, stick them in the Q&A window, in the chat window, and we'll scoop them up at the end as well. So over to you, Rob.
Hi. For our demonstration, we're going to look at Howard Osborne, a sales representative. When we open up Howard's card, we can see here information about who Howard is, so his job role, the location he works at. We can see his contact details. So by clicking on the phone tab, we've got the information to reach out to him. And we can also see information around his manager, along with exactly the same in terms of contact details. So all of this helps us to inform a view of who Howard is and the kind of activities we would expect him to be performing. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see Howard's risk trends. And if we push this back a little further, maybe to the last month or so, we can see that Howard typically has got a fairly flat baseline. Typically nothing happening here that raises any concern. However, we then have this particular spike. And if we look at this spike of information and click on it, we can then start to see how we've built up this information, how we've arrived at this particular score. So clicking on the spike, we can see he has a score of 379. And looking further down here, we can start to see all of these events that are attributed to that score. So here we can see various abnormal access events, some information around SharePoint, accessing a document folder, and various application activities too. Howard's activity itself is analysed in near real time, and it's evaluated against his own history, his peers, and also the organisation's previous behaviour. So every time Howard does something outside of his personal baseline, we can then have an associated risk score to it. So before we move further into the investigation with Dan, I'm going to explain how advanced analytics builds out our data models and how we describe a user or entity and calculate a risk associated to them. So clicking on Data Insights, we'll click down to see more. And by using Data Insights, we can look under the hood a little to see all of the things that we know about Howard. So we'll just collapse our assets view and let's look at something like applications. So this is where advanced analytics begins to add context and visibility to collecting all the collected log data. Log data itself is attributable to various types of activity, and we saw the various options here. And this enables us to build out a baseline. The baseline enables advanced analytics to understand what normal looks like. We can begin by looking at the models we built up to describe Howard's application usage. So here we can see all the different things that he's gone on to, so Salesforce, KeePassX, etc. And in fact, we can actually see here that he's had 191 different data points stored for him, basically showing all the different applications that he's accessed. So there are 13 distinct applications, and there's 191 different types of access to them. If we scroll down a touch further, we can see the country of origin. So here we can see that all these various applications have been accessed whilst he was out in the US. And we can also see across the right-hand side here his application activity times. And again, all of this is looking fairly straightforward, nothing particularly kind of raising any kind of concern in there. Interestingly, if we look here on the left, we can also see the information we've captured around this web browsing activity. And it seems kind of a fairly eclectic mix of web browsers within an environment. By modeling all of these data points, we're not making any conclusions about good or bad. We're simply stating the facts around his activity. If I now scroll up a little further and we go back to our VPN example, we can see here that we've got the source IP address, and we can see that we have 28 separate, effectively, authentications. So 28 separate times he's used a VPN, and we can see we've got 8 different values. And again, looking at these different IP addresses, we can assume from this that it's pretty much using the same ISP each time he's authenticating in. Similarly, we can see the kind of volume of data that is transmitting over VPN as well. So again, all of this information that we collect from the VPN log sources, and we make it much more visual. So rather than just having it collected in a log store, here we're modeling it and giving you a much stronger visualization. And again, dropping further down here, we can see from VPN countries that all of his access is coming out of the US. And again, that ties pretty much in with this application activity, where that was showing again that all those applications were accessed by the US as well. So now we have this information, we can start to apply statistical modeling to it. So take, for example, our different endpoints here for Howard. We can see that all of his activity comes in from what would appear to be his laptop. We can also see, as I mentioned earlier, the different ISPs, so we can see his different source addresses and his different country of origin as well. Modeling all these different data points, if we start to see different countries appearing, different IP addresses, perhaps if we start to see different hosts appearing up here as well, All of these different things could then indicate levels of risk. So every time that Howard does something that's not normal for him, that's different to his baseline that we understand, we can start to attribute risk to that behavior. That risk itself can be automatically applied using our scoring, so our out-of-the-box behavior, or an organization can change the weighting based on how they view that level of risk. So in this scenario here, if Howard Osborne would never have a requirement to be outside the US and using a VPN, and maybe even the organization as well, we could start to put more risk if we started to see access coming out of countries, let's say out of Europe, or coming out of China, something like that perhaps. So depending on where that location comes from, we can attribute different levels of risk. If enough anomalous behavior is seen, so it starts to attract enough risk itself, that information itself will become notable. So enough anomalous activity for Howard will make Howard become notable for us, and therefore we would then suggest that he's worthy of an investigation. Fully understanding a user's behavior, both normal and abnormal, so not just the bad things, but just day-to-day activities as well, is really crucial to good analytics and reducing false positives for a SOC. Behavioral modeling of a user and entities enable your business to answer questions you didn't know how to ask of a traditional logging platform. Okay, so now as promised, and to see how smart timelines and data models are combined for an investigation, it's over to Dan.
So thanks, Rob. Let's have a look at how we actually use some of these data points, this data science, and all this information and contextualized and enriched metadata that we have collected and that we've learned and we've derived. Let's see how we use that in reality. So let's take a look at this particular user, Howard Osborne, down here, and let's jump straight into his timeline. So what we're seeing here is Howard's usage and Howard's access and what Howard's doing during his session. So first off, we see him log on. Normal log on, we don't expect to see anything different from that. We then see him log on to Salesforce. So this is obviously logging onto a cloud application. This isn't touching any of his internal infrastructure, any of the enterprise infrastructure that perhaps would be generating logs or monitoring or perhaps even controlling anything that people did from the office. Now, this is the first time he logs on to this application for this particular workstation. He's logged onto it before, but it's the first time he's logged into Salesforce with it. We can even take a look and actually take a brief check and look at the data of what he has actually used before. So before he's used this machine here, ITH Osborne 888, but today he's deciding to come in with a machine that kind of looks similar in name, kind of looks like it might be a corporate machine at first glance, but actually it's not. It's not something he's actually logged on to Salesforce before. So we detect an anomaly for that. It's also the first time he's done it from this particular ISP. So it's doing it from perhaps a new location, new dial-up, whatever. But we're adding risk because it's not his normal place that he comes in from. It's also a new browser string. Perhaps he normally uses a Mac. Today he's using a Windows box. So again, it's allowed access. It's a successful login into Salesforce. Nothing's wrong with this. We're just detecting these anomalies based on the data that we've learned and we've seen before. It then goes through and does lots of normal activity, application activity. And what we can actually show, again, because we're collecting this data, and this is all data that's in the models, we just haven't detected any anomalies with this activity data here, that's the application data. We still show it. So it's useful for an analyst to actually come through, and if they want to go into here, they can actually expand this out and then actually see what kind of browsing's been done. I guess it helps explain the story a little bit. It might not be something that an analyst would look at straight away, but when they come back to start looking at, well, there's some not normal things happening here. It's not normal access into this system. There's some not normal application activity. So what else has he been doing? So there's lots of directory browsing happening in here. Lots and lots and lots of different things being looked at. This also could be a kind of indirect sign to the analyst of the fact that Howard is browsing around, sort of window shopping, seeing what's there. So after he's done all that application activity, he then comes and creates a command, sets a command off in Salesforce, which is not normal. First of all, it's not normal because he accesses accounts all, the accounts all object. He doesn't normally do that. See, normally, again, we can click on the button here, we can click on the link, and we can actually see what data he normally looks at. He normally looks at these data strings, these sets of application data. That's his normal working role. He doesn't normally look at all accounts. So this is not normal. He then starts to create a report. It's the first time anyone in his peer group has ever created reports. Perhaps they have a sales ops team that actually normally creates them. We're also detecting the anomaly because it's the first time he's done it personally. So we're comparing his application activity, not just to him and his own data science models. You can see what he normally does here. But it's also the fact that we're comparing that activity to his peer groups as well. So then we see him export a report. He's done that before. No anomaly into that section. He then goes and deletes a report. And again, like we saw before, this is brand new activity for him. He's never deleted a report before, and none of his peers in his sales reps group have ever deleted reports before. So this looks like a sign of someone having coming into the system, maybe trying to hide where they are, not doing it from a corporate device, browsing around, doing some window shopping, and then doing a sort of high-level encompassing search to create some reports, look at all the account data, export all that account data, and then delete it. Anomalies we're detecting here because these things are not normal. After this, we then see him log on to another cloud application, Office 365 in this instance. And again, we're seeing this happen as he goes to a couple of different pages in here, again, from this new browser string. It's not what he normally uses. Again, we see him doing some normal application activity. But again, we can perhaps look by some of the timestamps in here. He's doing lots of these things and window shopping. He's browsing around, seeing what sort of stuff he can see, just having a quick look what's in there within the system that perhaps he could extract. So he does lots of little application calls from it. And then once again, we see another activity which we define as a fact-based anomaly in the fact that he's downloaded a top-level document folder. He's taking everything that we have from that. We then see a USB write happen, which adds us in another little chunk of risk. And then we actually see a DLP alert fire. So something in one of those keyword searches has triggered and has flagged us up as a sensitive data leak. Now, that's a fact-based alert we've seen here. Von2 tells us that's a fact. But again, this is the first time anyone in the organization has actually triggered this kind of data alert. So throughout all of this, we're looking and we're defining access and application calls and activity, which is not normal for Howard to do. He's allowed to do all of these things. He's doing them from a location where we traditionally wouldn't be collecting these logs. He's doing this activity from a remote place, not in the enterprise workspace, not in the office. And he's doing it out to cloud applications as well, which are traditionally very, very difficult to kind of see that information, let alone go into the depth of showing us exactly what things he normally accesses and identifying the anomalies of why these activities and why this access is not normal for him, not normal for his peer groups. So now we've taken a look at that. I'll pass back to Rob. Perhaps Rob can take us through and maybe have a little bit more in-depth about perhaps how we might go and try and hunt for some of this information as well.
Thanks, Dan. In addition to using things like the timeline to investigate users and to see behavior, Exabeam also supports a feature called Threat Hunter. And Threat Hunter enables us to investigate and search for things that are happening inside the estate. So by clicking on the search bar on the top, we can access Threat Hunter. And from within here, we've got a whole range of different options we can select. But the first thing I'd like to look at is a nice and simple one around alerts. So if we've received an alert from a particular platform, like Von2, as the Howard example showed earlier, part of that email would be an alert ID. So we can simply type the alert ID into our platform, and it will bring back any alerts that match that particular ID. So here, for example, we have the Howard one that we saw earlier, and clicking on Howard, we will now be shown the alert ID, and we can see all the information around it, pretty much like what you would receive perhaps in an email from the platform. However, if we collapse that alert ID and scroll up slightly, we can now see the context around what happened with that Von2 alert. So we can see all of the activity that occurred before it and everything that happened after it, both the normal things as well as the abnormal things. This really helps to automate the processes for SOC teams without having to build all these things together manually each time. So timelines for users and assets. Exabeam are building these things out automatically. And so we add that kind of level of context and alert priority around alerts that you may be receiving into your environment. Another option we have with Threat Hunter, again, if we click on the search bar, we can now click on different options around here in terms of filters. So for example, if I was interested in seeing all users as switched to service accounts or privileged accounts, we have an option in here, a search available to us. So I can simply begin to type switch to, and then the type ahead will bring everything out that matches. The one I'm most interested here is switch to a privileged or executive account. Select my time frame that I'm interested in, and I could add any additional filters as well. But for now, we'll just do a search. Over here, we get back through accounts. Now, I mentioned earlier in my models video around context that we provide for users. So username, job title, a picture, and so on. And so within here, we can see we've got Julieta, Barbara, and Marty. We can also see their job roles too. So seeing an IT administrator switching accounts is perhaps not too unusual. And across the right-hand side here, we've got various elements that we've brought together. Clicking on the accounts option will now show me all of the various accounts that Julieta has accessed. So her own, an admin, and a third account really that she's seeing here. If I look down again next, I can see Barbara Salazar as HR, and probably Barbara doing an account switch would be a little bit more unusual. So again, clicking under accounts, I can see all the different ones, and B Salazar, and then an SA account. So perhaps a service administrator account that she's accessed here, but certainly something that would be unusual. So the very next thing I can now do is jump to the timeline. So again, in the same way as we did with alerts and as Dan showed earlier, jumping to the timeline gives us context. So from within here, we can now start to see exactly what Barbara did before this account switch took place. So now I can simply scroll down, and as soon as I start to see these little indicators here, again, as Dan mentioned before, these demonstrate things, for example, when someone has changed their account. So for this, effectively, they would have switched from Barbara Salazar to the SA account.
Cool. Thanks, Rob. So hopefully that's given you a good little run through there of showing how we can start detecting some of those malicious insiders or malicious outsiders, as we have now, as well as compromised credentials as well. And it's not just, a single credential that can get compromised. The first credential might not be compromised, but then another one following it is, and how we can kind of threat hunt and how we can kind of derive those things back afterwards as well. So I hope you found that information useful. We'll probably try and open it up now. Sam, if you've got any questions, far away if we've had any in the chat window.
Yes, we've had some in the chat and we've had some in the Q&A as well. I know Rob did answer one, but I think it's good. It's worth bringing this up as well. I'll start with some of the ones in the chat. If you do think of questions as we're going, please drop them in the Q&A section or add them to the chat, either or. I can field from both sides.
First one we had in was asking around obfuscation and encryption, particularly around PII data. So we do provide a range of flexible data masking options within the analytics tool. So we can hide that based on role. And we also provide encryption options as well. So particularly, for example, if we have things out in our SaaS environment, we can provide an encrypted instance, for example, within SaaS. So we definitely offer those options in. And then our second question came in was around user monitoring and affecting people's rights and Big Brother washing. Again, this is potentially a question for your individual organization, but ordinarily you have a right to monitor your users' activities. So if they are performing tasks within the organization and using laptops and devices, most organizations' contracts will have the ability to record those logs for staff and to be monitored. We also have a positive response from things, for example, like in Germany's Workers' Council, which are quite focused in this area. And again, this is typically for the fact that with our machine learning and data modeling approach, we're not picking on a particular user, for want of a better word. We're not looking for a reason to let somebody go from an organization. Because we're simply baselining users' activity, providing their activity falls within the norm for them and the peers and their orgs, then they're not really going to get elevated in any kind of meaningful way to be investigated. It's only if their own actions drive that kind of level of focus that then it would get raised to the top. So typically, we have a very good response from organizations around kind of monitoring of users and devices.
Rob, I think another good point to add on to that is the fact that certainly within an Exabeam platform, we're not generating any new logs. We're merely showing you your very large, complex set of logs. We're making sense of them and we're showing you that information quickly. The chances are, if you already have a SIM solution or if you already actually are logging stuff elsewhere, these logs you're already generating. You've had the rights to create these logs for a long, long time, and you have been. Just because you can't see them or can't make sense of them doesn't mean you haven't already had the right to collect them. That's always something that's quite often overlooked as well.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we've got another question here around, okay, so how do you model session start for a user having mobile phone on, desktop PC at home, still logged on via VPN and badging in locally to the office?
Okay, so session starts. They would typically be seen when we start a session, a users began their working day, if you will. So that's particularly driven via things like a VPN logging in or a Windows authentication event to effectively authenticate against a DC or something like that. We have other mechanisms that we can start sessions as well. So we can choose to do it via badging as well if we wish to. So there's a whole, again, it's a flexible thing that we have within the platform. They're kind of like the go-tos, if you will, from out of the box. Things, for example, like a mobile phone, that wouldn't typically generate a start session unless that mobile phone was logging in. If it was just collecting email activity, email wouldn't typically start a session off in that same sense. We would normally attribute users' activity against things like a login type process.
Awesome, thank you.
So we've got a question saying, is this third party or something we've developed?
Yeah.
It's entirely our platform. So it's entirely our solution. Basically, we have our own developers. It's all in-house.
Okay, a couple more questions from the chat. Can we build our own rules and models?
You certainly can. So there's several hundred by default in the tool, but you can certainly add your own in there as well. And again, we can help you with that with our customer support or PS at installation point. But yeah, you certainly can do it, all controlled by the GUI. The best option really is find something that's similar to what you want and then just plagiarize it.
Awesome, thank you. If I don't currently collect cloud logs, how would we get Office 365 data in?
So that can be brought in quite simply, actually. We have the ability within Exabeam, we have a solution called Cloud Connector, which is a large library of APIs, which will, I guess, perform technically what seems to be a reasonably simple task, which is go and make an API call out to a cloud platform, gather the logs it needs, bring them back, turn them into a syslog and provide them to the Exabeam system. So getting stuff out of Office 365, nice and simple. There's a big, big library of other APIs as well for other cloud platforms. That can get those logs in, and then we can process them in exactly the same way as it would be an on-premise or an off-premise log. They then are presented to us as a simple log.
And just to add to that as well, that can obviously go straight into analytics via syslog, as Dan said, or equally, if you've got an existing scene and you'd like to do some more stuff with cloud data inside your own log store, then you could forward them into your own log store and then forward them across to analytics as well. So you can also effectively get a double benefit from that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How is Exabeam licensed?
So Exabeam, across all of our solution options, apart from one, I'll cover that in a second, is licensed on the number of users in the organization. Now that's not a count, that's kind of beating hearts, the number of employees, the number of people in the organization. So you can have one person can have multiple identities. We saw from Rob's threat hunt in there that Juliet Donaldson had two accounts, Juliet Donaldson and Juliet Donaldson admin. That's just one user, never mind the two accounts. The one thing that isn't user-based is entity analytics. Funny enough, the clues there, it's based on the number of entities, the number of devices in the organization. Now, when it comes to users, we do have a slight change in definition of the users. We have a separate license SKU for users that don't use IT assets. I guess is a reasonable definition from it. The best thing is to get in contact with us. We can walk through what those are. It's designed to help those types of organizations that maybe sort of things like manufacturing or retail, where a large population of the user workforce don't have a laptop or don't use IT assets. They're sort of non-IT type stuff. But get in touch with your partner. or an Exabeam rep or whoever you're talking to, and we can help work through those scenarios with you.
Can we onboard some non-standard data from custom applications, heavy machineries to run analytics on them? That's in the Q&A if you just wanted to read the question.
Okay. So as a sweeping statement, yes, but the devil is always in the detail. So providing you're able to assist us in terms of understanding what that data looks like, so you can provide it in an unencrypted form. So once we can see the data and therefore can parse it, we use regex for parsers. So we will write them, and we write them as part of your license as well. So we do that. You can also write your own, or a partner could do it. But absolutely, you can write those parsers for your data sets. If it falls into our standard kind of naming structure, so if it's an application event, it's an authentication event, DLP, then we could categorize it to fall under one of those existing categories. And then it would take benefit of all of the existing tooling without having to kind of reinventing the whole wheel. So typically, yes. And we have that from a whole variety of sources. So we have people that bring in specific accounting and tax records and applications. We have people that deal with shipping, with freight. So yeah, absolutely. As long as you can describe the logs to us, we can parse it and then ingest.
And I think that's an important point actually in there, Rob, actually to mention is the activity types. All our modeling and behavior-based stuff is on an activity type. It doesn't matter what the raw log source is. We just make sure that we categorize it at the right thing, and then it just automatically fills in to all of those behavioral models and the risk scoring ruling at the back end. So just by adding a new parser into something means you can bring a log source into a system, and then all the existing information and behavioral ruling and modeling and all that kind of stuff is already built for you there. You don't have to build a complete start to end set of use cases for everything.
Awesome. And we've had all sorts of non-standard use cases going on as well, haven't we? There's a great blog on our website talking about how some airlines have taken the analytics and changed it completely into something else. How long does it take to learn behavior?
So that's a good question. It's one we do get asked a lot, actually. There's a couple of different answers to that, and I'll get to the real one you probably want to understand at the end. The time it takes us to understand normal behavior depends on the volume of data that we have. We have some auto mechanisms in the data science models that measure their own quality. The more data we put into a model, or the faster we put data into a model, the faster that model converges, and we then use that model for detection. That's one answer to it. So the more data you put into it, the quicker it can learn. What we can also do is we can retrospectively import data. So we can import old data and learn that. We can, if we're augmenting an existing SIEM solution, we can go and pull from an API pull, from a SIEM solution, the last 90 days worth of data, churn the hell out of that, and then boom, our models are populated very quickly based on old data. The real answer to the question probably is if we start from day zero, how long does it take? Again, that depends on the dispersion and the volume of data. If I'm pushed and had to put an answer on it, somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks-ish, give or take the volume of data, the size of the organization you've got, and the kinds of data points you've got. But just to give you a bit of an idea from day zero, we're probably going to start converging models and chucking detections up for some parts, within 2 weeks, maybe some out to 4 to 6 weeks. Obviously, we're doing modeling based on an organization. We keep models based on organization content. We keep models based on peer group content, and we keep the same set of models based for each individual user. So the chances are we'll probably converge the most data in the organization first, then peer groups, and then individuals after, because of the other volume of data that comes through.
Brilliant. And also, I think it's important to note that that learning is constant, right? It's not that we learn and then we're done.
It's continual
process. There's another question in the Q&A box, which is related. So if you ingest a batch of new log sources post initial deployment, how does the normal modeling get affected by these? Will risk scores suddenly jump based on these new sources?
So it depends it depends what you do when you ingest them. So again, they can either be taken from day zero, and they will then be passed from day zero and then subsequently added to any data models after that. So if you do that, no, risk scores won't get re-added from old timelines. What you can do is if you add in log sources, what we can do is we can actually wind the clock back on our analytics. So you might add a new parser in, ingest some new log sources. we might say, right, go back and reprocess the events I've generated from the last 2 weeks or last month or something, and then kind of wind the analytics clock back to a month, 2 weeks, and start from there. So we can either start from day zero and just start them on board. If you've got an old log source, you can bring stuff in, then we can go and wind the clock back and sort of retrospectively allocate risk as we add them into the timelines from sort of old data as well. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that.
Love it when I talk on mute. It's my favourite me. Okay, we've got one more question in the chat. Currently, we've done all the ones in the Q&A. So if my SIM is on premises, can I still go for a SaaS solution from Exabeam?
Yes, and in fact, you've got the right person on the call with Sam. She's all things SaaS. However, yes, you can. So if you've got one of the many popular SIEM tools that are on-prem, absolutely, we've installed a site collector that effectively takes syslog feeds in from your existing log store. It will then pipe that out into our SaaS platform and feed it across into our analytics tool. And yeah, absolutely. At that point, you would have analytics in the cloud along with log collection on-prem.
All right, guys. Well, look, thank you so much. That was a really good presentation. Like I say, there were lots of people commenting in the chat. They've enjoyed it and found it useful. So if you're able to join us later on for the happy hour, it will be a great session. We've got entertainment. We've got some great talks going on as well. So please, if you can, come along. All of the sessions from the last 2 days have been recorded. So if you haven't been able to attend everything, appreciate people have real jobs to do as well, then you can go back and watch those presentations at your leisure. If you haven't yet checked out the area with the content in it on the event site, please go and have a look in there. There's specifically a really good white paper around insider threat, which is obviously topical based on what we've just been talking about. And we hope to see you at 4 o'clock UK time. Thank you very much for attending. And thanks, chaps.
Really appreciate all of you for coming to the webinar. Thank you very much.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, guys.
Cheers.